The morning sun broke across Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with a kind of piercing clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Garrison Thorne stepped through the main gate with an economy of movement that spoke of decades of purposeful living. At 72, his frame had thinned, his shoulders had rounded slightly, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent more time squinting into harsh winds than most people spend indoors. He wore simple civilian clothes, a faded canvas jacket over a plain shirt, jeans that had seen better years, and scuff boots that looked like they had walked through more than a few countries. The security guard barely glanced at his identification before waving him through. To anyone watching, he was just another retiree visiting the base, perhaps for a reunion or a ceremony, perhaps to reconnect with old memories. There is nothing about his appearance that commanded attention, nothing that suggested he was anything more than what he appeared to be, an old man moving slowly through a world that had moved on without him. Inside the main training complex, the energy was electric. A group of young SEALs had just completed a grueling morning session, and they moved through the corridors with that particular swagger that came from knowing they were among the elite. Their uniforms were crisp, their bodies honed to peak condition, their confidence unshakable. They had survived Hell Week, earned their tridents, and now wore them with the pride of warriors who believed they had conquered the unconquerable. Petty Officer Brett Calloway led the group, his jaw sharp, his eyes bright, with the kind of certainty that only came from never having truly failed at anything that mattered. At 24, he was already being talked about as a rising star, someone who would make chief before 30, maybe even command one day. He moved like he owned the space around him, and in many ways, he did. Garrison moved down the same corridor, his gait slower, his presence almost invisible. He carried a small duffel bag that looked as old as he did, and his eyes took in everything with the quiet observation of a man who had learned long ago that the most important things were often the ones people overlooked. Breck noticed him first. He nudged Finn Ashworth, a wiry 23-year-old with a quick smile and quicker tongue. "Look at Grandpa," Breck said, his voice low enough to be discreet but loud enough for his team to hear. "Must be lost on his way to the commissary." Finn grinned, his eyes tracking the old man as he moved past them without acknowledgement. "Think he knows where he is? Maybe we should call someone to pick him up." Dax Merriweather, broader and quieter than the others, but no less confident, shook his head with mock concern. "Poor guy probably thinks it is still 1970. Someone should tell him the war ended." The laughter was soft, casual, the kind of humor that bonded young warriors who believed they had earned the right to judge. Garrison heard every word. His hearing, despite his age, remained sharp, honed by years of listening for sounds that meant the difference between life and death. But he did not turn, did not react, did not break his stride. He simply continued forward, his expression unchanged, his eyes focused on some distant point ahead. Before we go any further into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you are watching from. Maybe you have witnessed moments where someone's true character surprised everyone around them. These moments happen everywhere, in every community, and they remind us that respect and courage are not always worn on the surface. Garrison reached the main assembly area, a large open space where various training activities took place throughout the day. Today, it was quieter, set up for what appeared to be some kind of ceremony or briefing. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, a podium stood at the front, and several flags hung motionless in the still air. He found a seat near the back, away from the center of activity, and settled in with the patience of a man who had spent countless hours waiting for moments that mattered. The young SEALs filed in behind him, still talking among themselves, still riding the high of their morning's accomplishments. They took seats closer to the front, their energy filling the space, their voices carrying easily across the room. Garrison watched them with eyes that revealed nothing, his hands resting quietly on his knees, his breathing slow and steady. More personnel began to arrive. Senior enlisted men and women, officers of various ranks, civilian contractors, and support staff. The room filled with the comfortable noise of people who worked together, who understood each other's roles, who operated within a system they trusted. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that something significant was about to happen, though most in the room did not yet know what it was. Breck glanced back at Garrison once more, his expression one of mild amusement mixed with something like pity. He leaned toward Finn and whispered something that made both of them smile. Garrison's face remained impassive, carved from stone and time, revealing absolutely nothing of what moved behind those weathered features. The room continued to fill as more personnel found their seats. Garrison remained perfectly still in his chair, his posture neither rigid nor slouched, but rather settled into that middle ground of restful alertness that came from decades of knowing when to conserve energy and when to explode into action. His eyes moved across the space with the systematic sweep of someone conducting a tactical assessment, though to anyone watching, he simply appeared to be an old man gazing around with mild curiosity. Chief Petty Officer Ramon Ibarra entered through the side door, his bearing unmistakably military despite his relaxed stride. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen enough to know what truly mattered and what did not. His eyes found Garrison almost immediately, and something flickered across his face, a moment of recognition or perhaps question, but he said nothing. He found a seat several rows ahead, positioning himself where he could observe both the front of the room and the gathered personnel. Breck leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms with the satisfied exhaustion of a hard workout completed. He said something to Dax about the morning's training evolution, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear his casual expertise. Then his eyes drifted back to Garrison, and he shook his head with that same mixture of amusement and dismissal. "You think he is someone's grandfather?" Dax asked quietly, following Breck's gaze. "Maybe here to watch a graduation or something." Finn snorted softly. "If he is, someone should have told him to wear better clothes. Guy looks like he got dressed in the dark from a thrift store bin." The comment drew quiet laughter from the SEALs seated around them. It was not cruel laughter, not exactly, but rather the thoughtless humor of young men who had never learned to see past surfaces, who measured worth in physical capability and current relevance. To them, Garrison was simply outside their frame of reference, a relic from a world they had never known and saw no reason to understand. Garrison's fingers tapped once against his knee, the only outward sign that he had registered anything. His face remained neutral, his breathing unchanged, his gaze now focused on the flags at the front of the room. The American flag hung in the center, flanked by the Navy flag and the Naval Special Warfare flag. He studied them with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing more than just fabric and color, more than just symbols. He was seeing every operation those flags had flown over, every mission conducted in their name, every brother who had fallen defending what they represented. Lieutenant Nora Kincaid entered next, her uniform pressed sharp, her manner efficient and no-nonsense. At 31, she had earned her place through competence and determination, navigating a world that still questioned whether women belonged in certain spaces. She carried a clipboard and moved with purpose toward the front of the room, checking details, ensuring everything was in order for whatever was about to begin. Her eyes swept the assembled personnel with professional assessment, pausing briefly on Garrison before moving on without apparent recognition. More whispers circulated among the young SEALs. Breck stretched again, this time standing briefly to adjust his uniform, making sure his trident was perfectly positioned, his boots still carrying their morning shine despite the training. When he sat back down, he was even closer to his teammates, the group tightening into that brotherhood formation that made them feel invincible. "Think they will let Grandpa stay for whatever this is?" Finn asked, his tone suggesting it was more joke than genuine question. "Or will someone escort him to the visitor center?" Dax grinned. "Maybe he is the entertainment. Old war stories from the Korean War or something. You know how these ceremonies go? They always will out some ancient guy to talk about the good old days." The laughter came again, slightly louder this time, confidence breeding boldness. A few other young SEALs in nearby rows turned to see what was amusing, and when they followed the glances toward Garrison, Some of them joined in the quiet mirth. It was spreading now, becoming a shared moment among the youngest members of the command, a bonding experience over their collective superiority to this unremarkable old man who had somehow wandered into their world. Ramon Ibarra turned in his seat, his eyes finding the source of the laughter. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested disapproval. But he said nothing, instead turning back to face forward, though his shoulders carried a tension that had not been there moments before. Garrison finally shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other with the careful movement of someone whose joints had earned every creak and protest. His hands folded together on his lap, and for just a moment, those hands told a story his face would not. They were scarred, weathered beyond what simple age would account for, the knuckles thick with old breaks that had healed slightly wrong, the fingers bearing the permanent calluses of a man who had gripped weapons and ropes and the edges of helicopters through decades of hard use. But the young SEALs were not looking at his hands. They were looking at his face, his clothes, his age, and seeing only what they expected to see: irrelevance. Breck checked his watch, then glanced toward the entrance. "I wonder when the commander is getting here. I have another training block this afternoon, and I need to eat first." "Soon," Dax replied. "Kincaid is doing final checks. Whatever this is about to start." The room had nearly filled now, perhaps 60 or 70 personnel in total, representing various ranks and roles within the command structure. The energy had shifted from casual to something more formal, that instinctive military adjustment that happened when an official event was imminent. Conversations lowered in volume, postures straightened slightly, attention began to focus forward. And still Garrison sat in the back, unmoving, unnoticed by most, dismissed by those who had noticed, waiting with the infinite patience of a man who had learned long ago that time moved differently when you had seen enough of it. His eyes never stopped their systematic observation, cataloging faces, reading body language, assessing the room with the instincts that never truly left men like him, no matter how many years had passed since those instincts had meant survival. The side door opened with authority, and the change in the room was immediate. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, bodies straightened in chairs, eyes turned forward with the automatic discipline that came from years of conditioning. Commander Victor Halstead entered with the confident stride of a man who had earned every step of his rise through the ranks. At 48, he carried both the physical capability of someone who still trained alongside his men and the weathered wisdom of someone who had led them through situations where wrong decisions meant body bags. His uniform was immaculate. His bearing spoke of 2 decades of special operations experience, and his eyes held that particular quality of leaders who had made life and death decisions in the dark places of the world and learned to live with the weight of them. He moved to the podium with economical grace, setting down a leather folder before surveying the assembled personnel with the kind of attention that made each person feel individually assessed. The young SEALs sat up straighter, their earlier swagger tempered by the presence of authority. Breck adjusted his posture, his face settling into professional neutrality. Finn stopped fidgeting. Dax placed both feet flat on the floor and squared his shoulders. This was a man they respected, a commander who had been where they hoped to go, who had done what they hoped to do, who represented the pinnacle of what they aspired to become. "Good morning," Commander Halstead said, his voice carrying easily through the space without needing to be raised. His tone was conversational, but commanded attention effortlessly. "Thank you all for being here. I know this was short notice, and I appreciate your flexibility." He paused, letting his eyes sweep the room once more. Garrison remained motionless in the back, but for the first time since entering, his attention sharpened in a way that was almost visible. His eyes fixed on the commander with the focused intensity of someone evaluating not just what was being said, but who was saying it, measuring the man against some internal standard known only to himself. "We are here today for something important," Halstead continued. "Something that I believe speaks to the core of who we are as naval special warfare operators, as sailors, and as people who have chosen to serve something larger than ourselves. Breck glanced sideways at Finn with a look that suggested this was going to be one of those speeches, the kind that commanders gave when they wanted to remind everyone of their shared purpose and values. Not unwelcome, but predictable. Finn suppressed a small smile of recognition. They had heard versions of this before, the appeals to tradition and honor and the warrior spirit. But Halstead was not looking at the young SEALs in the front rows. His eyes had found Ramon Ibarra, and something passed between them, a silent communication that spoke of shared knowledge. Ramon gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, and Halstead's expression shifted into something deeper, more solemn. "Before we begin, I want to talk about respect," Halstead said, and now his tone had changed, carrying an edge that made people lean forward slightly. Not the respect that comes from rank, though that has its place. Not the respect that comes from physical capability, though we value that highly. I want to talk about the respect that comes from understanding that we are part of a continuum, a line that stretches back through decades of men and women who did this work before we were born, who set the standards we now try to meet, who paid prices we were still benefiting from. The room had gone completely still. Even the young SEALs sensed that this was not going to be a standard motivational speech. Something else was happening, though they could not yet identify what. Halstead's eyes moved across the assembled faces, and for a brief moment, they passed over Garrison without stopping, without acknowledgement, as if the old man in the back was simply part of the furniture. But there was something in that passing glance, something too controlled to be genuine indifference. "We live in a present-tense world," Halstead continued. "Everything is about now, about current capabilities, about what you can do today. That is important. That is necessary. But it can also make us blind to history, to legacy, to the fact that every tool we use, every technique we employ, every standard we uphold was built on the backs of men who came before us. Men who figured things out the hard way, who paid for knowledge with blood and mistakes, who set the bar that we now take for granted." Garrison's hands remained folded in his lap, but his thumb moved once, a small gesture that might have been tension or might have been something else entirely. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes never left the commander. Lieutenant Kincaid had moved to stand along the side wall, her clipboard forgotten in her hand, her attention entirely on Halstead. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when something significant was building, when his words were leading somewhere unexpected. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the back of the room, toward Garrison, then back to her commander with a question forming behind her professional expression. "I am telling you this," Halstead said, his voice dropping slightly so that people had to focus harder to hear, "because in a few minutes, you're going to meet someone. And I need you to understand, before that happens, that how you respond to this person will say more about you than any training evolution ever could. It will reveal whether you understand what it means to be part of something larger than yourself, or whether you think history began the day you earned your trident." The young SEALs exchanged confused glances. Breck's forehead creased slightly, trying to puzzle out where this was going. Dax shifted in his seat, suddenly less comfortable. Finn's easy smile had faded into uncertainty. Ramon Ibarra sat perfectly still, but his hands had moved to grip the armrests of his chair, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was preparing himself for something. He knew what was coming, and he knew how the young SEALs were about to feel when they realized what they had done. Halstead straightened to his full height, his shoulders back, his presence filling the front of the room with command authority. The leather folder on the podium remained closed, its contents still secret. The flags hung motionless behind him. The room held its collective breath without quite knowing why. And in the back, Garrison Thorne waited, as he had waited through countless briefings and ceremonies and moments that had shaped the history these young warriors did not yet know they were part of. His face showed nothing. His body revealed nothing. But his eyes, those eyes that had seen things these SEALs could not imagine, held a depth that would have stopped their casual mockery cold if they had thought to look closely enough to see it. Commander Halstead stepped away from the podium, moving to the side in a way that opened up the space at the front of the room. His movement was deliberate, purposeful, and it created a vacuum of attention that drew every eye forward. But he did not speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence build, let the anticipation grow, let the tension wind tighter until the room felt like a coiled spring waiting for release. Breck shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence beginning to crack at the edges. Something about the commander's demeanor had changed, something that suggested this was not going to be a routine ceremony or standard briefing. He glanced at his teammates, seeing his own uncertainty reflected back at him. Finn's usual quick smile was nowhere to be seen. Dax had gone very still, his body language shifting from casual confidence to wary attention. But before Halstead could continue, the moment fractured. A young petty officer near the front, new enough to the command that he had not yet learned when to keep his mouth shut, leaned toward his neighbor and spoke in what he thought was a whisper, but carried further than he intended. Is this about that old guy in the back? Someone's grandfather or something? Why is he even here? The words cut through the room like a blade through silk. Several heads turned, some toward the speaker, others toward Garrison. A few of the younger SEALs, emboldened by someone else voicing what they had been thinking, allowed themselves small smiles of acknowledgement. The question seemed reasonable to them, natural even. What was an old civilian doing at what was clearly a military function? Breck, sensing an opportunity to reassert some of the swagger that had been slipping away under Halstead's intense setup, turned more fully in his seat to look at Garrison. His voice, when he spoke, was not quite loud enough to be openly disrespectful, but it carried clearly in the silence. Yeah, someone should probably help him find where he is supposed to be. This is probably not it. Maybe the retiree center is having their meeting in a different building. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the younger SEALs. It was the kind of laugh that comes from nervous energy, finding release from young men who were uncomfortable with tension they did not understand and defaulted to humor as a coping mechanism. But it was also the laugh of people who genuinely believed they were being reasonable, that they were simply stating an obvious truth that others were too polite to mention. Garrison did not react. His expression remained unchanged, his posture unaltered, his hands still folded calmly in his lap. But something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment or might have been recognition of a pattern he had seen play out countless times before. Young warriors who had not yet learned that strength came in forms they had not been taught to recognize, that valor had a shelf life far longer than physical youth, that the most dangerous men in any room were often the ones nobody noticed. Ramon Ibarra's jaw clenched so tight that the muscles stood out along his neck. His hands gripped the armrests harder, his knuckles going white with the force of restraint. He started to turn, started to say something that would have scorched the paint off the walls, but Halstead's hand came up in a small gesture that stopped him cold. Not yet. The gesture said, let them dig deeper. Let them learn this lesson the way it needs to be learned. Lieutenant Kincaid's eyes had gone wide with something very close to horror. She had been in the room earlier when the young SEALs arrived, had heard their comments, had dismissed them as thoughtless youth that would be corrected in time. But now, watching them double down in front of the commander, watching them mock someone during what was clearly meant to be a significant moment, she felt her professional detachment crumble in a second-hand embarrassment for what was about to happen to them. Halstead's expression had transformed. The measured solemnity from moments before had been replaced by something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. His eyes moved from Breck to the young petty officer who had spoken first, then slowly across every face in the front rows, cataloging, remembering, storing away information about character that would influence evaluations and assignments for months to come. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made quiet more terrifying than shouting. I want everyone who just laughed, everyone who just smiled, everyone who just agreed with those comments, to remember this moment. Remember exactly how confident you felt. Remember exactly how certain you were that you knew what you were looking at. Remember the assumptions you made based on appearance, on age, on your own inflated sense of what matters and what is not. The laughter died instantly. Breck's face drained of color as he realized he had miscalculated badly. Finn seemed to shrink in his seat. Dax looked like he wanted to melt through the floor. The young petty officer who had started it all looked like he might be sick. But Halstead was not done. "You are SEALs," he said, each word landing like a physical blow. "You are supposed to be the best of the best. You are supposed to be able to read situations, assess threats, understand that things are not always what they appear to be. And yet, in the span of 30 minutes, you have demonstrated that you cannot see past the surface of anything. You have shown me that for all your training, for all your physical capability, for all your pride and that trident on your chest, you have not learned the first thing about respect, about humility, about understanding that there are levels to this profession that you have not even begun to comprehend." The room had gone beyond silent. It had achieved that particular quality of stillness that comes when people are holding their breath, when every person is desperately hoping not to be noticed, not to be called out, not to be made an example of. The young SEALs who had laughed looked stricken. Those who had not laughed looked relieved and sympathetic in equal measure. And through it all, Garrison Thorne sat in the back row, unchanged, unmoved, his weathered face revealing absolutely nothing of what he thought or felt about any of it. He simply waited, as patient as stone, as inevitable as the tide, for whatever came next. The weight of Halstead's words settled over the room like a physical pressure, making the air itself feel heavier, harder to breathe. Breck stared straight ahead now. His earlier swagger completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of someone who had just realized they had stepped on a landmine and were waiting for it to detonate. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand how a moment that had felt so casual, so reasonable, had transformed into this. Finn had gone pale, his usual quick humor abandoned entirely. He kept his eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, as if by not looking at anyone he could somehow make himself invisible. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped his knees, and a thin sheen of sweat had begun to form on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning of the room. Dax sat rigid, his broad shoulders hunched forward slightly in a posture that spoke of a man trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. His jaw was clenched so tight that a muscle twitched rhythmically along his cheek. He had stopped breathing normally, instead taking small, shallow breaths through his nose like someone trying not to make a sound in enemy territory. Halstead let the silence stretch for another 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. It was a deliberate choice, a teaching technique he had learned from leaders who had taught him, letting discomfort do the work that words sometimes could not. He watched the young SEALs squirm, watched them process their mistake, watched them begin to understand that they had revealed something about themselves that they could not take back. Lieutenant Kincaid remained against the side wall, her clipboard now hanging forgotten at her side. Her professional mask had slipped enough to show genuine concern for what was about to happen. She had seen Halstead angry before, had seen him disappointed, but this was different. This had a quality of cold calculation that suggested he was not just correcting a mistake, but teaching a lesson that would be remembered for years. Ramon Ibarra had released his death grip on the armrests, but remained coiled with tension. His eyes moved from Halstead to the young SEALs, to Garrison and back again, tracking the dynamics of the moment with the practiced awareness of someone who had been in enough command situations to recognize when something significant was unfolding. His expression had settled into grim satisfaction, the look of a man watching justice slowly unfold. In the back row, Garrison finally moved. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but his head tilted slightly to the side, and his eyes narrowed, just a fraction. For the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at Breck, and the young SEAL, perhaps feeling the weight of that gaze, turned his head and met those eyes. What Breck saw there froze something deep in his chest. They were not the eyes of an old man, not really. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things Breck could not imagine, had done things Breck had only trained for, had survived situations where Breck would have died in seconds. They were calm eyes, patient eyes, but beneath that calm was something ancient and immovable, like bedrock beneath soil. Breck turned away quickly, his face flushing with shame that was only beginning to fully form. His hands had started to shake, and he pressed them flat against his thighs to hide the tremor. Halstead moved back toward the podium, his steps measured, his presence commanding the space with effortless authority. He placed his hands on either side of the leather folder, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted from anger to something more controlled, more educational, but no less intense. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, "and I want you to listen very carefully, because this story is about to become the most important thing you have heard in your career so far. This is about to redefine how you think about service, about legacy, about what it means to be part of this community." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled personnel one more time. Some of you in this room already know this story. Some of you have heard pieces of it. But most of you, especially our younger operators, have no idea what you are about to learn. The room leaned forward collectively, drawn by the gravity in his voice, by the promise of revelation. Even the young SEALs who were still reeling from their public dressing down could not help but be pulled in by the narrative hook Halstead had set. In the early 1980s, Halstead began. Naval Special Warfare was still finding itself, still defining what it would become. We had legends from Vietnam, we had a proud history, but we were also evolving, adapting, figuring out how to meet new threats in new ways. And during that time, there were men who did things that set the standards we still use today. Men who pioneered techniques, who pushed boundaries, who paid the price for the knowledge we now take for granted. Garrison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something that might have been recognition, or memory, or perhaps pain, flickered across his weathered features before disappearing back into his carefully maintained neutrality. His hands unfolded and refolded, a small gesture that released some tension he had been holding. One of those men, Halstead continued, operated in places we still cannot talk about, did things that remain classified to this day, and earned a reputation among the people who mattered as one of the most capable operators ever to wear a trident. He did not seek recognition. He did not chase medals or promotions. He simply did the work, mission after mission, year after year, in the dark places where failure meant death and success meant silence. The young SEALs were completely still now, their earlier shame momentarily suspended by the pull of the story. They were warriors, after all, and warriors were always drawn to tales of legendary operators, of men who had achieved what they aspired to. But none of them had yet made the connection, had not yet realized why this story was being told in this moment, in this room, with that old man sitting quietly in the back. Halstead's hands gripped the sides of the podium tighter, his knuckles whitening slightly. His voice, when he continued, carried a reverence that made even the most distracted listener focus completely on his words. This man, Halstead said, his voice carrying a weight that made every word feel carved in stone, participated in operations that shaped the future of naval special warfare. He was part of the teams that developed close-quarters battle techniques we still teach today. He helped pioneer maritime interdiction procedures that became standard across special operations. He trained alongside Delta Force, SAS, and every other elite unit you can name, and by all accounts, he held his own against the best in the world. The commander paused, letting that sink in. Around the room, personnel who had been in the Navy long enough to understand what that meant exchanged knowing glances. Lieutenant Kincaid's eyes had gone wide with dawning realization. Ramon Ibarra's grim satisfaction had transformed into something closer to solemn respect. But the young SEALs in the front rows still had not connected the pieces. They were listening to a story about a legend, not understanding that legends did not stay young forever, did not remain frozen in the moment of their greatest achievements. He did 3 tours in Central America during operations that officially never happened. Halstead continued. He was in Grenada when we had to pull off one of the most complex hostage rescues in our history. He operated in the Mediterranean when terrorism was exploding across Europe and the Middle East. And through it all, he remained calm, professional, and absolutely lethal when the situation demanded it. Garrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes had shifted from Halstead to some point in the middle distance, seeing not the room around him, but something else, somewhere else, someone else. His breathing had changed rhythm slightly, becoming more measured, more controlled, the way it did when memories pressed close and threatened to overwhelm the careful walls he had built around them. But what made him truly exceptional, Halstead said, and now his voice dropped lower, became more intimate, forcing everyone to strain slightly to hear, was not his tactical skills or his physical capabilities, though both were extraordinary. What made him truly exceptional was his ability to make everyone around him better. He trained younger operators with patience and precision. He mentored men who would go on to become legends in their own right. He understood that the mission was always bigger than any individual, that the team mattered more than personal glory, that the future of naval special warfare depended on passing knowledge forward. Breck felt something cold beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. He still did not understand why, but some instinct was telling him that this story was leading somewhere he did not want to go, that revelation was approaching like an oncoming train, and he was tied to the tracks. His eyes flickered toward the back of the room almost involuntarily, then away again, his mind refusing to make the connection that his gut was already screaming at him. Finn had started to breathe faster, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid movements. His hands had begun to tremble again, and this time he could not stop them. Sweat ran down the side of his face despite the cool temperature. He looked like a man watching a horror movie, knowing something terrible was about to happen, but unable to look away. Dax sat absolutely frozen, every muscle in his body locked rigid. His eyes were fixed on Halstead with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if by focusing hard enough on the commander, he could somehow prevent what was coming, could somehow rewind time to before they had made their casual, thoughtless comments. He retired at the rank of Master Chief, Halstead said, and there was something in how he said the words that made them sound like a title of nobility, which in the world of naval special warfare, they essentially were. He walked away from the teams at a time when he could have stayed, could have moved into command positions, could have built a second career on his reputation. But he chose to step back, to let younger men have their moment, to live quietly with his service rather than trading on it. The commander's hands released the podium, and he stood to his full height, his shoulders back, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. And for the last 30 years, he has lived as a private citizen. No books written, no speaking tours, no attempts to capitalize on his service or his reputation. He simply lived his life, stayed connected to his brothers from the teams when they reached out, and maintained the kind of dignity that comes from knowing who you are and not needing anyone else to validate it. Lieutenant Kincaid had closed her eyes briefly, a gesture that looked almost like a prayer or perhaps preparation for impact. When she opened them again, they were filled with a mixture of respect and deep sympathy for what the young SEALs were about to experience. Ramon Ibarra had turned fully in his seat now, no longer pretending to face forward. His eyes were locked on Garrison with an expression that combined reverence, gratitude, and something very close to love. This was clearly a man he knew, a man he respected beyond measure, a man whose presence in this room meant something profound that was about to be revealed to those too young and foolish to have understood it on their own. Halstead let the silence build again, watching the young SEALs, seeing the first cracks of understanding beginning to form in their expressions. Breck's face had gone from pale to flushed to pale again. Finn looked like he might actually be sick. Dax had started to shake his head slowly, a tiny motion of denial, of desperate hope that what he was beginning to suspect was not actually true. So when this man, this legend, this warrior who helped build the naval special warfare you were so proud to be part of, decided to visit our command today, Halstead said, his voice now carrying an edge sharp enough to cut steel, I thought it would be appropriate to gather everyone together to pay our respects. To say thank you. To acknowledge that everything we have, everything we are, stands on the shoulders of men like him. The commander's eyes swept across the front rows one final time, and in that moment, every young SEAL in the room knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. They knew, and the knowledge was crushing them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it, no way to take back their words, no way to undo their casual cruelty. Halstead turned slowly, deliberately, his body language shifting from commanding officer to something that approached ceremony. His right hand moved to his side, not yet rising in salute, but preparing for it, positioning itself with the careful intention of a man about to perform a ritual that mattered deeply. His eyes locked onto the back of the room, onto Garrison Thorne, and in that locking of gazes, in that moment of silent communication between two warriors separated by rank and age, but united by understanding, the entire room understood what was about to happen. The young SEALs felt it like a physical blow. Breck's hands flew to cover his face, then dropped again, trembling, as if he could not decide whether to hide or to face what was coming. His breathing had become ragged, his chest heaving with the effort of controlling panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Every casual comment, every dismissive glance, every moment of thoughtless superiority crashed over him in a wave of shame so profound it felt like drowning. Finn had gone completely white, all color drained from his face, as if someone had opened a valve and let his blood run out. His mouth worked soundlessly, trying to form words that would not come, apologies that felt utterly inadequate before they could even be spoken. Tears had formed at the corners of his eyes, not from sadness, but from the crushing weight of realizing he had mocked a man who represented everything he had trained his entire adult life to become. Dax had bent forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, his entire body shaking with silent, desperate regret. He looked like a man who had just watched himself destroy something irreplaceable, who understood in one terrible moment that he had revealed a character flaw so deep it called into question everything he thought he knew about himself. Around the room, the other personnel watched with a mixture of sympathy and judgment. The older chiefs and senior enlisted, men and women who had been around long enough to know better, to recognize quality regardless of packaging, looked at the young SEALs with expressions that said they had just witnessed a teaching moment that would echo through this command for years. Some looked disappointed. Some looked satisfied that a lesson was being learned the hard way. None looked pleased. Lieutenant Kincaid had pressed her hand against her mouth, her eyes glistening with emotion. She was young enough to remember what it felt like to make career-defining mistakes, old enough to recognize when someone was about to have their understanding of the world fundamentally altered. She felt genuine pain for the young SEALs, even as she understood the necessity of what was happening. Ramon Ibarra had stood up, his movement drawing attention across the room. He moved to position himself in the aisle, his posture already shifting into the rigid formality of a man preparing to render honors. His face had settled into an expression of fierce pride mixed with deep solemnity, the look of someone who had waited a long time for this moment, who understood its significance beyond what most people in the room could comprehend. Garrison remained seated, but something had changed in his bearing. The carefully maintained invisibility had begun to fade, replaced by something harder to define. He sat straighter, his shoulders settling into alignment that spoke of decades of military discipline. His hands unfolded and came to rest on his thighs in a position that was neither casual nor formal, but something in between, the natural stance of a warrior at ease, but ready. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes had sharpened, focused, taking in a room with an intensity that had been hidden beneath his earlier passivity. "Master Chief Garrison Thorne," Halstead said, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of recognition and shock spreading outward in concentric circles. United States Navy, retired. 32 years of service. 28 years with Naval Special Warfare. 4 Bronze Stars, 2 with Valor Device. The Silver Star. 3 Purple Hearts. And more classified commendations than I am authorized to mention in this setting. The young petty officer who had first made the comment about Grandpa looked like he wanted the earth to open and swallow him whole. His face had gone through so many color changes it now looked mottled, splotchy with shame and horror. His hands gripped the chair in front of him so hard his knuckles had turned white, and he was shaking with full body tremors that he could not control. Other young SEALs who had smiled or laughed, or even just thought dismissive thoughts were experiencing their own private agonies. Some stared at the floor. Some stared at Garrison with expressions of dawning, awe mixed with crushing guilt. Some looked like they might actually be physically ill, their faces green, their breathing shallow and rapid. Halstead continued, his voice now carrying not anger, but something closer to reverence. Master Chief Thorne participated in operations across 3 decades that shaped modern special operations doctrine. He trained with the original members of SEAL Team 6. He operated alongside the most elite units in the world and earned their respect through competence and character. He saved lives. He completed missions that others said were impossible. And he did it all without seeking recognition, without demanding acknowledgement, without ever trading on his reputation. Garrison's jaw worked slightly, the only outward sign that hearing his service enumerated publicly was affecting him. His eyes had taken on a distant quality again, seeing not this room, but other rooms, other moments, other men who had stood beside him in places where mourning was never guaranteed. His hands had begun to show the slight tremor that sometimes came to warriors when old memories pressed close, when the ghosts of operations long past demanded acknowledgement. The commander's hand began to rise, moving with ceremonial slowness toward his forehead. Master Chief Thorne has asked for no special treatment, no ceremony, no public acknowledgement. He came here today simply to visit, to see how the teams have evolved, to quietly observe what his generation helped build. But I decided that was not acceptable. I decided that we needed to do this, needed to show our respect, needed to demonstrate to everyone in this room, especially our youngest operators, what true humility looks like, what real service means, and what we owe to the men who came before us. Breck had started to cry, silent tears running down his face as he stared at the back of the room at the man he had dismissed so casually, so cruelly, so thoughtlessly. His entire understanding of himself, of his place in the world, of what it meant to be a warrior, was being dismantled and rebuilt in real time, and the process was excruciating. Halstead's hand completed its journey, snapping into a crisp salute that held all the precision of decades of military discipline combined with genuine reverence. His body was rigid at attention, his eyes locked on Garrison with an intensity that communicated respect beyond what words could convey. The gesture hung in the air like something tangible, transforming the room from a simple assembly space into something sacred, a moment where past and present aligned and honored each other. For 3 long seconds, Garrison did not move. He sat in his chair, weathered hands still resting on his thighs, his face still bearing that carefully maintained neutrality that had protected him through decades of operations and years of civilian life. But something was shifting behind his eyes, some internal calculation being made, some decision being reached about whether to accept this public recognition or to deflect it, as he had deflected so many other attempts to celebrate his service. Then, slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man whose body no longer obeyed commands with youthful speed, but still remembered every protocol with perfect clarity, Garrison Thorne stood. The motion took longer than it would have 30 years ago, his knees protesting, his back adjusting to vertical alignment with small pops and creaks that spoke of hard miles and harder landings. But he stood, and as he rose, something remarkable happened to the room. Every person who had been seated came to their feet. It started with Ramon Ibarra, who shot up like he had been launched, his own hand snapping into a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. Then Lieutenant Kincaid, her clipboard clattering to the floor forgotten as she stood and saluted with tears now streaming openly down her face. Then the senior chiefs, the experienced operators, the men and women who understood what they were witnessing. They rose like a wave moving through the room, each one coming to attention, each one rendering honors to a man who represented the best of what they aspired to be. The young SEALs stumbled to their feet last, their movements clumsy with shock and shame, their salutes shaking as they tried to hold position while their entire understanding of the morning crashed down around them. Breck's face was still wet with tears, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, his salute wavering as his arm trembled with emotion. Finn had lost all color entirely, looking like he might pass out at any moment, but he held his salute with desperate determination. Dax stood with his eyes squeezed shut, unable to look at Garrison, unable to face the magnitude of his mistake, but unwilling to fail in this moment of rendering the honors he should have shown from the beginning. Garrison straightened fully, his body remembering the posture, even if it took more effort now. His shoulders went back, his spine aligned, his chin lifted slightly, and in that transformation from old man in civilian clothes to Master Chief in bearing, if not uniform, the room saw what they should have seen from the first moment. They saw the warrior beneath the weathered exterior, the steel beneath the rust, the legend beneath the years. His right hand rose in return salute, and though the movement was slower than it had been in his prime, though his arm shook slightly from the effort of holding position, there was nothing diminished about the gesture. It carried the weight of 32 years of service, of missions completed and brothers lost, of standards upheld and traditions honored. It carried the acknowledgement of all who stood saluting him, the acceptance of their respect, even as it clearly made him uncomfortable to be the center of such attention. The room held that tableau for 10 seconds that felt like an eternity. Commander and Master Chief locked in mutual salute. Ramon Ibarra rigid with pride. Lieutenant Kincaid openly weeping. The young SEALs dying inside while trying to hold military bearing. 60 people frozen in a moment that would be remembered and retold for years. A teaching moment that would become legend within the command. Then Halstead dropped his salute with crisp precision, and the room followed his lead, hands dropping, bodies relaxing slightly from rigid attention, though no one sat back down. The commander's expression had softened from the harsh judgment of earlier to something more complex, a mixture of satisfaction at the lesson taught and genuine warmth for the man he was honoring. Master Chief Thorne, Halstead said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. On behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command, on behalf of every operator who has benefited from the standards you helped establish and the knowledge you helped preserve, and on behalf of the young warriors in this room who are about to learn what it truly means to walk in the footsteps of giants, I want to thank you for your service, for your sacrifice, and for your continued dedication to remaining part of this community, even when you had every right to walk away and never look back. Garrison's jaw worked again, his throat moving as he swallowed hard. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than expected, gravelly with age and emotion, but it carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had led warriors through hell and brought them home. Thank you, Commander. The honor is mine. The words were simple, almost plain, but they carried weight because of who spoke them and how. There was no false modesty, no attempt to deflect or minimize. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that said more about character than any speech could have conveyed. Halstead nodded, then gestured toward the front of the room. Master Chief, would you please join me? There are some people here who need to meet you properly, who need to understand what they were looking at when they failed to see you clearly. The words were not accusatory, exactly, but they landed on the young SEALs like physical blows nonetheless. Breck flinched visibly. Finn made a small sound that might have been a sob he tried to suppress. Dax kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to watch Garrison walk forward, unable to face the moment when the man they had mocked would pass within feet of them. Garrison moved down the aisle with careful steps, his gait showing his age but also showing something else. There was a particular way he moved through space, an economy of motion, a tactical awareness that never fully left men like him. He was scanning without seeming to scan, aware of every person, every exit, every potential threat despite being in the safest place he could possibly be. It was instinct hardwired so deep it had become part of his DNA. As he passed the row where Breck and his teammates sat, he paused for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that the young SEALs felt it like a spotlight. Then he continued forward, leaving them to marinate in their shame and regret. Garrison reached the front of the room and took position beside Commander Halstead, the two men standing together in a way that spoke volumes about mutual respect across generations. The contrast was striking. Halstead in his crisp uniform, still in his physical prime, representing the current standard of naval special warfare excellence. Garrison in his civilian clothes, aged and weathered, representing the foundation upon which that standard had been built. Together, they formed a living bridge between past and present, a visual representation of continuity and legacy. Halstead turned to address the room again, his expression serious but no longer harsh. What you witnessed here today, what happened in this room before Master Chief Thorne arrived and after, is something I want you to remember for the rest of your careers. This was not about embarrassing anyone. This was not about punishment. This was about teaching a lesson that cannot be taught in a training evolution or learned from a manual. He paused, letting his eyes move across the faces staring back at him, paying particular attention to the young SEALs who still looked like they had been physically struck. You are warriors. You are trained to assess threats, to read situations, to make split-second judgments about people and environments. But today, you failed that assessment completely. You looked at a man and saw only age, only civilian clothes, only someone who did not fit your narrow definition of what a warrior looks like. And in doing so, you revealed a dangerous blind spot that could get you killed in the field. The words landed hard. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, but because the truth was uncomfortable to hear stated so plainly. The young SEALs looked like they wanted to sink through the floor, but Halstead was not done with them yet. The enemy does not always look dangerous, the commander continued. The most lethal people you will ever encounter often look completely unremarkable. They blend in. They appear harmless. They rely on you making assumptions based on appearance. And if you cannot see past surface details to recognize capability, if you cannot show respect to people whose value is not immediately obvious, then you're not as ready for this work as you think you are. Ramon Ibarra had moved to stand near the side wall, his arms crossed, his expression one of grim agreement. He had clearly witnessed this kind of lesson before, had perhaps even learned it himself the hard way years ago. His eyes moved between Halstead, Garrison, and the young SEALs with the watchful attention of someone cataloging who learned the lesson and who was still resisting it. Lieutenant Kincaid had recovered her composure somewhat, though her eyes were still red. She stood at attention along the opposite wall, her clipboard retrieved but forgotten in her hands. She watched Garrison with undisguised admiration, the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly how rare men like him were, how much they had sacrificed, how little recognition they had sought. Garrison himself stood quietly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his expression neutral. He looked like a man enduring something necessary, but uncomfortable, someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding this kind of spotlight and was tolerating it now only because his commander had asked him to. But there was also something in his eyes, a recognition that this moment was serving a purpose, that these young SEALs were learning something important even if the method was painful. Halstead turned to Garrison, his voice softening. "Master Chief, would you be willing to say a few words? I think everyone here would benefit from hearing your perspective." For a long moment, Garrison said nothing. He looked out at the assembled personnel, his gaze moving slowly across their faces, taking in the mixture of respect, curiosity, and in the case of the young SEALs who had mocked him, profound shame and regret. His weathered face worked through some internal calculation, weighing whether he wanted to speak at all, whether he had anything to say that would matter. Finally, he cleared his throat, a rough sound that carried in the silent room. His voice, when he spoke, had a quality that made people lean forward to hear, not because it was quiet, but because it commanded attention through sheer authenticity. "I did not come here today expecting this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the assembled group, at the ceremony that had unfolded. "I came because Commander Halstead invited me to see how the teams have evolved, to witness firsthand how the next generation is being trained. I came to observe, not to be observed." He paused, his eyes finding Breck in the crowd. The young SEAL looked like he might actually die from shame, but Garrison's expression held no anger, no judgment, just a kind of tired understanding. "When I was your age," Garrison continued, his voice growing stronger. I thought I knew everything. I had made it through BUD/S. I had earned my trident. I was convinced that having achieved that meant I understood what it meant to be a warrior. But I was wrong. Making it through training just meant I had met the minimum standard. Understanding what it meant to serve, what it meant to be part of something larger than myself, what it meant to honor those who came before me, that took years to learn. Some of it I'm still learning. Around the room, heads nodded. The senior enlisted, the experienced operators, they understood exactly what he meant. The young SEALs listened with the desperate attention of students who had just failed a test badly and were being given a chance to understand where they went wrong. "You looked at me today and saw an old man," Garrison said, and there was no accusation in his tone, just statement of fact. "You saw someone who did not fit your image of what matters in this community. And I do not blame you for that. Society teaches us to value youth, to dismiss age, to believe that relevance has an expiration date. But in this profession, in this brotherhood, that thinking can be fatal." He shifted his weight slightly, his knees protesting the extended standing, but his voice never wavered. "The men who train me are mostly gone now. Some died in operations. Some died from injuries sustained in service. Some simply got old and passed on. But every single one of them taught me something that saved my life or the lives of my teammates. And if I had looked at them the way you looked at me this morning, if I had dismissed them because they did not look dangerous anymore, I would have missed knowledge that I could not have gained any other way." Finn had begun crying again, silent tears that he made no attempt to hide. Dak still had his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tight. Breck stared at Garrison with an expression that combined horror at what he had done with desperate hope that somehow, someway, redemption might be possible. Garrison's eyes swept across them all one more time. "Learn from this," he said simply. "Learn to see people. Learn to show respect, not because someone earned it by looking impressive, but because respect is what you owe to everyone until they prove they do not deserve it. Learn that wisdom, experience, and capability do not always come in packages you expect. And learn that the measure of a warrior is not just in how well they fight, but in how well they recognize and honor the warriors who came before them." The silence that followed Garrison's words felt sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath in recognition of wisdom delivered not from a podium of authority, but from the hard-won experience of a life lived in service. Commander Halstead stood beside him with an expression that mixed pride, satisfaction, and something that approached reverence. He had orchestrated this moment, had known it would be difficult, had understood that some lessons could only be learned through the sharp edge of shame followed by the healing balm of grace. And watching it unfold, seeing the transformation beginning in the eyes of the young SEALs, he knew the pain had been necessary. Ramon Ibarra moved forward from his position against the wall, his steps deliberate and purposeful. He approached the front of the room and came to attention before Garrison, his hand rising in a salute that held personal meaning beyond military protocol. "Master Chief," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I served under you in 1993. You probably do not remember me. I was a third class at the time, fresh to the teams, thought I was hot stuff because I had made it through training. You pulled me aside after an evolution where I had been showboating, trying to prove I was the best in the room." Garrison's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind clearly working through decades of faces and memories, trying to place this man. Ramon saw the effort and smiled slightly through his emotion. "You told me that the best operators are the ones nobody notices until the moment they are needed. You said that quiet professionals get the job done while loud amateurs get people killed. And then you spent the next 6 months teaching me how to actually do the work instead of performing it." Recognition dawned in Garrison's weathered features. "Ibarra," he said, his voice carrying a note of pleased surprise. "You were the kid from Texas. Fast as hell, cocky as they come, and dumb enough to think speed could replace tactics." Ramon laughed, a sound that broke some of the tension in the room. "That was me, Master Chief. And you straightened me out. Everything I know about being a professional, about being part of a team instead of being a solo act, I learned from watching you. You saved my career. More than that, you probably saved my life by teaching me to think before I acted. The exchange transformed something in the room. The young SEALs watched with fascination as this senior chief, a man they respected and perhaps feared a little, stood before Garrison with the demeanor of a student before a revered teacher. It provided context they had been missing, showed them in real time what legacy looked like, what it meant when the commander had talked about men who made everyone around him better. Lieutenant Kincaid stepped forward next, though she did not salute. Instead, she addressed Garrison with professional respect tempered by genuine emotion. "Master Chief Thorne, my father served with you in the late 80s. Chief Petty Officer Robert Kincaid. He passed away 4 years ago, but before he died, he made me promise that if I ever had the chance to meet you, I would thank you for bringing him home from an operation that went sideways in '87. He said you stayed behind to cover their extraction when you could have gone with them, that you held off hostiles alone for 40 minutes until the rescue bird could circle back. He said you were the reason he lived long enough to watch me grow up, to walk me down the aisle of my wedding, to hold his grandchildren." Garrison's face had gone still, but his eyes glistened with moisture that he did not try to hide. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion he could no longer fully control. "Robert Kincaid. He was a good man, a good operator. I am sorry for your loss. He should have had more years." "He did," Kincaid said softly, her own tears flowing freely now. "He had more years because of you, and he made sure I knew it. He made sure I understood that the teams were not just about individual glory or personal achievement, but about brotherhood and sacrifice and doing what needed to be done regardless of cost. He taught me those values, Master Chief, but he learned them from you." Around the room, more people were crying now. Not just the young SEALs wrestling with their shame, but senior personnel who understood the weight of what they were witnessing, who recognized that they were present for a moment that connected generations of warriors through bonds of shared sacrifice and mutual respect. This was not just a ceremony. This was communion, a gathering of the tribe to honor one of their elders and to learn from his example. Halstead let the moment breathe, let the emotions flow naturally without trying to control or redirect them. He understood that this was healing happening in real time, that the young SEALs who had started this morning with casual cruelty were being transformed by witnessing the reality of what they had dismissed, by seeing the concrete impact one man's service had rippled across decades and lives. Breck stood suddenly, his movement abrupt and desperate. He stepped into the aisle, his body shaking, his face still wet with tears that would not stop falling. "Master Chief," he said, his voice breaking on the words, "I need to apologize. I need to say that I am sorry for my disrespect, for my assumptions, for failing to see what I should have seen. There is no excuse for how I behaved. I was wrong. I was ignorant. I dishonored you, and I dishonored the uniform I wear, and I dishonored everything you built that allowed me to be here." The words came in a rush, tumbling over each other in his desperation to express the magnitude of his regret. Finn and Dax had stood as well, flanking him, their own faces twisted with shame and need for forgiveness. The young petty officer who had made the first comment stood behind them, looking like he might collapse at any moment. Garrison looked at them for a long moment. These young warriors who had wounded his pride, even if they had not wounded his character, who had revealed their own immaturity even as they thought they were displaying superiority. His face was unreadable, his body still, his breathing slow and measured. The room waited with held breath to see how he would respond, whether he would offer grace or judgment, forgiveness or condemnation. Then, slowly, Garrison moved toward them. Each step was careful, his aged body moving with the deliberation of someone who had to think about balance and stability. He stopped in front of Breck, close enough to touch, close enough that the young SEAL could see every line in his weathered face, every scar that told a story, every year that spoke of service and sacrifice. Garrison raised one scarred hand and placed it on Breck's shoulder, the gesture paternal and firm at the same time. "You made a mistake," Garrison said quietly, but in the silence of the room, every word carried. "You judged based on appearance. You dismissed based on age. You failed to show respect where it was due. These are serious failures, especially for warriors who claim to be elite. But here's what I learned in 32 years of service. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has moments where they fail to live up to the standards they claim to uphold. What matters is not that you failed. What matters is what you do after you realize you have failed. He paused, his hand still gripping Breck's shoulder. You apologized. You acknowledge your error. You feel genuine remorse. That tells me something about your character that is more important than your mistake. It tells me you can learn. It tells me you can grow. And it tells me that maybe someday you will be the kind of operator who makes the teams better instead of just being good yourself. Garrison's hand remained on Breck's shoulder for another moment before releasing. But the connection had been made, the forgiveness offered, and the young SEAL looked like a man who had been granted a reprieve he did not deserve, but would spend the rest of his career earning. Finn and Dax stepped forward as well, and Garrison acknowledged them with nods that conveyed understanding without diminishing the gravity of what had happened. The other young SEALs who had participated in the mockery watched with expressions that mixed relief with determination, each of them silently vowing to never repeat this mistake. Commander Halstead moved to stand beside Garrison again, his hand coming up to rest briefly on the older man's back in a gesture of solidarity and respect. I want everyone here to understand something, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, but also genuine emotion. What Master Chief Thorne just demonstrated is harder than any physical evolution you will ever complete. It is harder than Hell Week. It is harder than any combat operation. Extending grace to people who have wronged you, offering forgiveness when you have every right to withhold it, choosing to teach rather than punish. These are the acts that define true leadership and true character. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled personnel. Master Chief Thorne has nothing to prove to anyone in this room. His record speaks for itself. His service is beyond question. His legacy is secure regardless of how anyone here treats him. And yet, when given the opportunity to make these young warriors feel the full weight of their failure, he chose instead to lift them up, to give them a path forward, to invest in their growth rather than dwelling on their mistake. That is what separates good operators from great ones. That is what makes legends. Ramon Ibarra stepped forward again, positioning himself beside Halstead and Garrison in a way that formed a line of 3 generations. Master Chief, if I may, I would like to tell these young operators about Operation Crimson Tide. Not the classified details, but the parts that matter for this lesson. Garrison's jaw tightened slightly, discomfort flickering across his features. Ramon, that was a long time ago. It is not necessary to dredge up old operations. With respect, Master Chief, Ramon said firmly, it is absolutely necessary. Because these warriors need to understand what kind of man they were looking at this morning. They need context for what you represent. Garrison looked like he wanted to refuse, wanted to deflect this attention back into the shadows where he was comfortable. But Halstead caught his eye and gave a small nod of encouragement. With visible reluctance, Garrison stepped back slightly, ceding the floor to Ramon, who turned to address the room with the bearing of someone about to share something sacred. In 1993, Ramon began, we conducted a hostage rescue operation in a country I still cannot name. The intelligence was bad. The situation on the ground was worse than briefed. We went in with 8 operators and found ourselves facing 30-plus hostiles in a compound that was supposed to have been cleared. The exfil bird took fire on approach and had to abort. We were stuck in the middle of hostile territory with wounded teammates, rescued hostages who could not move fast, and enemies closing in from multiple directions. The room had gone completely silent, every person leaning forward to catch every word. Ramon's voice carried the weight of memory, of trauma survived, of brothers lost and found again. We set up a defensive position in a building that was falling apart around us. Ammunition was low. Communications were intermittent. The hostiles had us pinned and were moving to overrun our position. We had maybe 20 minutes before we would have been overwhelmed. He paused, his eyes finding Garrison. Master Chief Thorne was our team leader. He had been wounded in the initial breach, took shrapnel in his left leg and side, but he was still moving, still leading, still making decisions while bleeding through his uniform. He assessed the situation and realized that someone needed to draw the hostiles away from our position long enough for the backup exfil to arrive. Someone needed to create a diversion so loud and so threatening that the enemy would have to respond to it. Lieutenant Kincaid had both hands pressed over her mouth, already understanding where this story was going. The young SEALs stared with wide eyes, their earlier shame temporarily suspended by the pull of the narrative, by the recognition that they were hearing about real operations, real danger, real heroism of the kind they had only imagined. Master Chief Thorne took every explosive we had left, Ramon continued, his voice thickening with emotion. Every grenade, every charge, every piece of ordnance that could make noise and fire. He gave us his ammunition because we would need it to hold the position. Then he said, and I quote, "Give me 10 minutes. When you hear the fireworks, move fast to the backup LZ. Do not wait for me. Get the hostages and the wounded out. That is the mission." Garrison's face had gone still as stone, his eyes distant, seeing not this room, but that compound, that moment, that decision that had seemed so clear at the time, but had cost him so much. His hands had begun to tremble slightly, the old warrior's response to old trauma revisited. "We tried to argue," Ramon said. "We told him we would all go together, that we would fight our way out as a team. But he pulled rank. He ordered us to prepare to move. And then he took those explosives, and he left our position, and we heard him moving through that compound like a ghost, setting charges, calling out in the local language to draw attention, making himself the target that every hostile in the area had to respond to. The room was so quiet that breathing seemed loud. Tears streamed down Ramon's face now, unchecked and unashamed. For 8 minutes we heard gunfire, explosions, movement. We heard Master Chief Thorne conducting a one-man war against 30 hostiles. We heard him draw every enemy away from our position. And when the backup bird arrived and we moved to the LZ, we had to leave him behind because he had made sure we had no choice, had made sure the mission would succeed regardless of his personal outcome. Breck had gone pale again, but this time it was not from shame. It was from the dawning realization of what kind of sacrifice he was hearing about. What kind of courage existed in the man he had dismissed as someone's lost grandfather. Finn and Dax stood frozen, their faces reflecting the magnitude of what they were learning. The backup team went in for him. Ramon continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. They found him in a destroyed section of the compound, unconscious from blood loss, surrounded by dead hostiles, still gripping his sidearm with his last round chambered. The doctors said he should have died 3 times over from his wounds. But Master Chief Thorne had decided he was not done yet, had decided his team was getting out, and his body obeyed that decision long enough to make it happen. He turned back to Garrison, his voice breaking. "You saved 8 operators that day, Master Chief. You saved 6 hostages. You completed the mission when everyone else said it was impossible. And you did it by sacrificing yourself without hesitation, without complaint, without expecting recognition or reward. That is who you are. That is what you represent. And when these young warriors looked at you this morning, that is what they failed to see." The weight of Ramon's words hung in the air like something physical, pressing down on everyone in the room with the gravity of sacrifice and heroism that transcended anything they had imagined. Garrison stood silent, his weathered face betraying the cost of having those memories dragged into the light, of having actions he had considered simply doing his job elevated into something approaching legend. His hands had stopped trembling, but his eyes carried a distance that spoke of other rooms, other operations, other brothers who had not made it home despite his best efforts. Commander Halstead placed his hand on Garrison's shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity. "This is what I wanted you all to understand," he said, addressing the room, but looking at the young SEALs in particular. "This is why assumptions based on appearance are not just disrespectful, they are dangerous. This is why every person deserves your respect until they prove otherwise. And this is why the traditions and legacy of naval special warfare matter so deeply. Master Chief Thorne is not an exception. He is an example. There are dozens of men like him, hundreds of them, who serve with honor and courage and humility, who built the foundation we stand on, and who deserve our gratitude and respect regardless of whether they look the part anymore. Breck stepped forward again, but this time his movement was steadier, his purpose clearer. "Master Chief Thorn," he said, his voice still thick with emotion but carrying new determination, "I cannot undo what I said or how I behaved. But I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my career honoring what you taught me today. Not just about respect, but about what it means to serve something larger than myself. About sacrifice, about leadership, about being the kind of warrior who makes his team better rather than just being good himself." Garrison looked at the young SEAL for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That is all any of us can do," he said quietly. "Learn from our mistakes, grow from our failures, and try to be better tomorrow than we were today. You have that opportunity, petty officer. Use it well." Finn and Dax added their own promises, their own commitments to learn and grow and never repeat this failure. The other young SEALs who had participated in the mockery made similar vows, each of them transformed by what they had witnessed, by the grace they had been shown, by the lesson they had learned at the cost of their pride, but not their careers. Lieutenant Kincaid approached Garrison with something in her hands, a small wooden shadow box that held a folded flag and what appeared to be military decorations. "Master Chief," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "my father wanted you to have this. He kept it for years, waiting for the opportunity to present it to you in person, but he passed before that could happen. He made me promise that if I ever met you, I would give it to you and tell you what it represents." She opened the shadow box to reveal the silver star that had been awarded to her father for his actions in that same operation where Garrison had stayed behind. "This was his," Kincaid said softly. "He always said it should have been yours, that everything he did that day was possible only because you gave him the chance to do it. He wanted you to know that he lived his entire life grateful for what you sacrificed, and he taught his children to understand that freedom and safety are purchased by warriors like you at a cost most people never see or understand." Garrison's hand shook as he accepted the shadow box, his composure finally cracking as he looked down at the decorations, at the tangible evidence of legacy and impact that extended far beyond any mission or operation. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Robert was a good man, better than he knew. Tell his grandchildren about him. Make sure they know what kind of warrior, what kind of father, what kind of man he was." "I will, Master Chief," Kincaid promised. "And I will tell them about you as well. I will make sure they understand that the reason they have a family at all is because of men like you who stand in the gap when others cannot." Commander Halstead called the room back to attention, his voice carrying both authority and warmth. "Before we conclude, I want to establish something permanent. From this day forward, this assembly space will be known as Thorn Hall. Master Chief Garrison Thorn's name will be on the wall, along with a brief account of his service and sacrifice. Every operator who passes through this command will know who he is, what he did, and what he represents. That is our commitment to honoring not just him, but all the warriors who came before us and built what we now enjoy." Applause erupted through the room, spontaneous and heartfelt, growing from a few people to everyone present, a thunderous acknowledgement of respect earned and honor deserved. Garrison looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he stood straight, accepting it with the dignity of a man who understood that this moment was not really about him, but about what he represented, about the continuity of service, about the connection between generations of warriors. Ramon Ibarra called the room to attention one final time. "Master Chief Thorn may be retired, but he will always be one of us. He will always have a place here. He will always be welcome, and he will always be honored. That is our promise, and we keep our promises." The room responded with a unified sound of agreement, voices blending together in acknowledgement of a bond that transcended rank and time and the physical limitations that came with age. Garrison nodded, his eyes moving across the faces staring back at him with newfound respect and understanding, seeing in them the future of the teams he had helped build, the next generation of warriors who would carry forward the standards he had fought to establish. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to move, to approach Garrison with handshakes and words of gratitude, Breck and his teammates waited their turn. When they finally stood before him, the old warrior looked at them with eyes that held no anger, only the patient assessment of someone evaluating whether the lesson had truly been learned. "Make me proud," he said simply, "not by talking about what you learned today, but by living it, by showing respect, by honoring legacy, by being the kind of warriors who make everyone around them better. Do that, and this morning will have been worth it." "Yes, Master Chief," they responded in unison, the words carrying the weight of sacred vows. The room gradually emptied as personnel returned to their duties, but many lingered, wanting one more moment with Garrison, one more chance to say thank you, or share a memory, or simply stand in the presence of living history. And through it all, the old warrior remained patient, gracious, and humble, embodying the very qualities he had spent a lifetime trying to instill in others. As the morning sun climbed higher outside, streaming through the windows of what would now be known as Thorn Hall, a transformation had taken place. Young warriors had been humbled, then educated, then forgiven. Legacy had been honored. Sacrifice had been acknowledged, and the bridge between generations had been reinforced, ensuring that the values and standards built by men like Garrison Thorn would continue forward into a future they had fought to make possible. If this story touched you or made you think differently about respect, legacy, and the warriors who serve in silence, drop a comment and let us know. Tell us about your favorite moment, or share if you have ever encountered someone whose true character surprised you. Maybe you know a veteran whose service deserves more recognition, or perhaps you have learned a similar lesson about not judging by appearances. We would love to hear your thoughts and stories. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these important narratives about courage, sacrifice, and the values that bind us together as a community.